When you were playing a lot more studio work, which you don't do as much of now, I understand, how many sessions have you played on in a given period of time? What's the big number?
Well, for a while when I was working, I did sessions every week, three a day for 5 years, and one time I had a contest with another buddy of how many we each could do that week, and I did 26 in 5 days.
Holy mackerel! Somebody gave me a magic number of 2,000 in a period of time.
Yes, in about I guess about 3 years, 2,000 sessions. So I'm lucky I'm alive.
So Lee, the great Lee Ritenour, more than 2,000 sessions. My first question is, who was the buddy that you were competing with sessions?
Oh, that was Jay Graydon.
That was Jay Graydon.
Yeah. I think he actually did a couple more that week.
Well, you two were busy boys, man, during that time. And when you were talking about in that Dick Clark interview for American Bandstand, right?
Right.
That was.
Yeah.
Was that 5-year session? When would you approximate that was? That was kind of your session heyday.
Yeah. Well, it was definitely the 70s, and so I think 1974 was when I first really started doing quite a few sessions. I mean, I was working with Sergio Mendes and doing some stuff, but not like that.
Yeah.
When I was 19, and so it was 52, 62, 72. I was 20 then. So yeah. So actually 71 was probably the start of me doing sessions. But then that period where there was, so many where I was really established, because I was doing movies, TV shows, jingles, and Quincy, quiet. And then
It's rolling.
and then record dates, and the record dates would be, late night, come down and do an overdub. And Quincy was famous for that. He'd call me up, Ritenour, what you doing? I said, oh man, I can't work with you today. I got a full day. I got this movie and a jingle, and I'm booked until. He said, well, what time do you finish? I said, I don't know, probably 10 o'clock tonight. He said, great, come on down after that. and so sometimes we would do that kind of shit, and it was lucky you were in your 20s that you had the energy to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man, well, I'm so excited to talk to you, Lee, today about your session career. And I think we all know what an amazing career you've had as a solo artist and guitarist. But I think one part of your career that is often overlooked is just how important you are in the session community and for informing kind of the way that we hear pop music. And your sensibilities have permeated a lot of music that we all know and love and are still played to this day. I should also introduce, though, that we do have also another guest here, which is Quincy the dog.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's based on Quincy Jones or
No, this Quincy's way too blonde.
I really want to focus in on some songs we've kind of pre-selected in sort of conversations before that I think are maybe most emblematic of obviously just a snippet of your total work, because as you said, you were playing thousands of sessions every year at your peak in that kind of 5-year core period. I'd like to talk to you first about your work with the Brothers Johnson.
Oh yeah,
and the great song "Strawberry Letter 23." And obviously, the Brothers Johnson, there's some pretty amazing musicians among them. Louis Johnson had a great career and also played Michael Jackson and all this stuff. But you were brought in to play on that song. You're credited in it, and I think also the left-handed brother, I forget his name.
Well, George Johnson, and George was the guitar player,
right?
And Louis was the bass player.
Yep.
And then Strawberry Letter 23, Shuggy Otis
was the original
wrote it. Very, very good guitarist, songwriter, and he wrote the tunes. So somebody got Quincy the record, and I think I'd already done the first album with the Brothers Johnson.
Yep.
And this Strawberry Letter 23 was on the second album.
Yep.
And they went from, this was crazy because they were, I don't remember the story how Quincy discovered them or found them, but they were, grew up in Inglewood, and they were just out of high school, and then Quincy got a hold of them, and all of a sudden Look Out for Number One,
Right.
I believe was that big hit, and and that album just like took off, and they were headlining at the Forum, in Inglewood, 9 months later, and
Wow.
and neither of them knew how to handle that, and Quincy had some people kind of helping put a band together and stuff, but the record went from zero to their careers that nobody knew them, and they were just out of high school practically, to like boom,
Wow.
And of course that happens once in a while with songs and stars, and some people handle it better than others.
Sure.
So then and I played a lot on the first record, and then mostly rhythm stuff, and then that second record came in, and Quincy, quiet. And not the Quincy Jones, this Quincy. this Quincy's blonde. And anyway, so then so they Quincy heard this demo of Shuggy Otis doing Strawberry. It was Shuggy's tune, and Quincy thought it was perfect for the Brothers Johnson, and Shuggy had all that triplet stuff worked out in through
the solo
harmony,
yeah.
And it was very specific, and Shuggy had done it on the demo, and so Quincy got perfect. That would get George to play that, and George Johnson, the brother, right? But George was an amazing rhythm guitar player and a bit of a songwriter, but he wasn't really a lead player. So there was a great, incredible, famous engineer that worked with Quincy in those days named Bruce Swedien.
Who also worked with Michael Jackson records. And all
Exactly, I was just going to say. And so that combination was just unbelievable. So they were at the old A&M studios there in Hollywood, and by the time they got that track done, and now it was time to put in George's solo on it, they worked with George on it forever, and he was just not that kind of lead guitar player, and he'd learned how to play it, but he couldn't really play it, and that kind of, if you hear the record, it's kind of a tedious part, and so when you're recording that for hours and hours and hours, right? And so Quincy finally says, "Call Ritenour, he'll do it." And so a couple hours later, I was able to come by, and I walk in, and Quincy's walking down the hallway, like pulling his hair out at that point, and barely said hello to me, and he said, "I'm going to lunch. Ritenour, take care of this, get it done." And I walked into the room. I said, "Bruce, wow, what happened to Quincy? He's so he was in a terrible mood." He said, "Well, yeah, I'll tell you what's going on." And so, because they had also, I believe at some point they'd called Shuggy to try to play it. And Shuggy could play it. It was his tune, but it wasn't clean enough.
Yeah.
The thing about Michael Jackson stuff and everything Quincy did, and everything that Swedien put together with Quincy, it was all pretty polished.
Yeah.
It was like perfectly together. And Shuggy and George Johnson just couldn't get it together.
Yeah.
So then, so I isolated. It was three-part harmony, and it wasn't hard, and we knocked it out in a few hours, and then Quincy came back and heard it, and he said, "Yes."
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering if we could listen to a little piece of it, just for the benefit of viewers, but also just to kind of get your reaction to it in real time, if you don't mind.
Sure.
All right, let's bring it up. So, Strawberry Letter 23. Guitar strings are an incredibly important thing for any guitar player to realize their tone. For my 1968 Gibson ES335, my string of choice is the 10-gauge D'Addario XS strings. I have very corrosive sweat, and this is the only string that I have found that allows me to have not only great tone, but longevity, so I can pick this guitar up multiple times a day and not have to worry about restringing the guitar. Each gig, each session, I get a long life out of these strings and excellent tone. Now, not only am I a user of D'Addario strings, but Lee Ritenour, too, is a big fan and longtime user of their strings. Now, on Lee's guitars, he uses the D'Addario nickel-wound custom gauge 9 through 46 for his ES335. And on his L5, he uses a custom flat-wound 12 through 52. When you know, you know. It is the string that you go to, you come back to, and you know that it's always going to deliver on the tone. Check out the excess strings that I love if you're somebody who destroys strings like me with corrosive hands. And if you want to get some custom singles and put together something closer to what Lee uses, you can check those out over on the D'Addario website. We will have all their links in the description below, as well as right here in the video, so you can find your way to these very exact same sets. Now back to the interview with Lee. All right, here we go. So this part you played in the introduction.
No, this is all the little, what do they used to call that little toy piano thing, the kaleidoscope thing.
For rhythm guitar, any of the...
Oh, no, there's rhythm guitar. Yeah, I play some rhythm guitar on it too.
Okay.
And my biphaser's all over that.
Okay, the Neutron.
Yeah, the Neutron.
Big one.
Yeah. That's all me.
That's you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Quincy loved that sound because it took up the... His thing was always about orchestration, just like how it fit. So the Neutron thing really kind of bubbled in there without being too loud.
All right, let's grab this solo. Let's see if we...
Wow. I'll be basing on drops. Yep. I always thought it was too long. They should have. In today's world, it would have been half that.
Right. You get like a 45-second guitar solo.
Yeah. Oh, they put it in the reverb. Nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's got an amazing groove, and I love that phaser sound.
Yeah.
Did you have kind of like a go-to setting that you would use on a phaser that people would call for, or was this kind of like you'd set the speed to the song? And
well, no, I mean, because those Neutron bifasers, especially the original one, which, like you said, was big.
Yeah.
And the envelope on it was you had to be careful because it would scoop the top end of the frequencies, but it also really would scoop the bottom end.
Yeah.
And I remember, I think I used to use a deluxe reverb in those days, and one day I had this setting accidentally, it was in my travel case, and my roadies brought it, and that scoop was all the way up, and by accident, and I played something, I blew the speaker out. It was kind of like an octave divider without being an octave divider, because it would take that, but when you'd play a rhythm part and mute it, and the frequencies from the Neutron biphaser would just catch so nicely.
Yeah.
So Quincy loved that because he could put it down in the mix, and yet it would cut through.
Yeah.
So that was the thing about, and Dave Grusin, my buddy, who I still work with and have this new record coming out with, Dave was the same exact way. He loved that I was a schooled musician and could read all the stuff and was a great sight reader. I could play classical guitar and electric and play on all those movies and stuff. But then, far as the pedals, the Neutron was one that he also liked because you could put it in a film and like on 3 Days of the Condor,
right?
With that film with Robert Redford back in that day, and there's a bunch of scenes of him being chased and stuff, and the rhythm with Harvey Mason and me and a few of the other guys, just pump it along, and the biphaser and any of those kind of things we used back in the day to do those rhythm parts.
And do you think you used that deluxe reverb on this track if you were to guess what amp you were using back then?
I believe it was, yeah.
And do you think it was your 335?
Oh, for sure it was the 335.
The same one that's over in the guitar boat over here. We'll get a shot of that in B-roll so people can see the hit maker, so to speak.
Yeah.
Were there any other kind of pedals that you would say were kind of common that you would use? Because I could see like some stuff on like live footage of you that you had like those modules like Orange Squeezer. It looks like it that would like plugged into your 335. Was that typical?
Yeah, the one and the scratch. Gary, give me the 335 for a minute. I believe the
all the oh yeah, from where kind of the edge of the module kind of scraped against it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
but that was that compressor was that was a jewel.
Yeah,
for us to discover that stuff, because the 335 is a great guitar. It was a phenomenal guitar, but plugged into a deluxe reverb, and of course your hands bring all that stuff up, but a lot of these parts were rhythm parts, and you weren't playing lead, and so you didn't have the amp up where it was distorting too much.
Yeah.
Could have a little bit of edge to give it some hair, but basically it was mostly clean. And the amps weren't like the more modern amps that are built today that already have a lot of presence built in.
Yeah.
So that orange squeezer came along, and it just brought everything up to stuff, and it would enhance all the other, the Mutron biphaser for sure, but all the other, Mutron had a bunch of other products out that I occasionally used, and so it would help, that was the go-to guy.
Yeah, it would like the envelope filter and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because it definitely helps with triggering the envelope when you have a little bit more output coming from that compressor, for sure.
That's right.
It makes it a little bit more interactive under the fingers, I guess, without having to go to extreme settings.
Yeah, so I noticed it's, with it sitting on the guitar there on the 335, I just started to scratch it, but it sounded so good, you say, heck with it.
That's so cool. Well, Lee, another song that I want to talk to you about that you famously played on is the song Deacon Blues by Steely Dan.
Right.
And there's, again, just another group of powerhouse guitar players on that. You got Dean Parks, you got Larry Carlton. And I've always wondered, you're credited on that, but I've never been able to detect which part is you versus which part is Larry Carlton. We know Dean was the acoustic, and he was just kind of going throughout. Do you know what parts you played on that song?
Well, what those guys would do, first of all, I got called for a lot more Steely Dan sessions than I could do, because they'd always call at the last minute, kind of like Quincy, but I was always booked, and they would start in the afternoon, and they said, what are you doing tomorrow? And I said, I'm booked. What are you doing the next day? I'm booked. Like next week or 2 weeks from now? And then they go, no. But they ended up getting Dean and Carlton a lot, and then a couple of the New York guys.
Yep.
And so they must have called me maybe 10 times, and I thought they wouldn't call. And finally I was available, and ended up coming over, and they were like mad scientists, because they would have you try everything, and so some of those fills, I can't tell if it's me or Larry. Mm-hmm. I know it's not Dean, because he was playing acoustic, I think, primarily on that one. And so, but all of us, and then Jake Radin, I think, he's on Deacon Blues, but
he's on Peg.
He's on Peg, so all of us, and I remember us being at a session with Graydon and me, Graydon and me and Dean, and the Asia came out, and we had to look on the credits to see if we made the record.
Right.
Because you just never knew, and they would just pepper and orchestrate everything.
Yeah.
Just like crazy. They would it's like you might have one lick that you thought was Carlton, and it probably was, and then 2 bars later, it's Dean Parks or me, or somebody like that. And so they would record everything, and then they would orchestrate it later.
Yeah.
So it's pretty amazing. And again, going back to the Mutron biphaser, if you listen to Deacon Blues, finally at the end of the tune, the last 1 minute or 2 minutes, whatever it is, that part comes back on, that same rhythm part that I kind of played on the Brothers Johnson. I ended up playing on Deacon Blues, All
right, well, do you mind if we listen to? We can all right, let's bring it up. We will get right back to the interview, but first I'd like to talk to you about one of the sponsors that makes these interviews possible. It's our friends over at Sweetwater and their amazing program, the Sweetwater Gear Exchange. It's a platform where you can buy and sell used gear with your peers, and the amazing thing about it is you don't have to pay any seller fees as you ordinarily would with most other platforms, so long as you decide to put your earnings onto a Sweetwater gift card. And if you're somebody like me that's constantly buying and selling gear, it's a great way to basically create your own layaway program by way of these gift cards to accrue money and savings and then redeem them on the gear that you actually want. I've already purchased 2 guitars this way using the Sweetwater Gear Exchange, a 1961 Fender Stratocaster Custom Shop Relic reissue, and a Gretsch Smoke Brian Setzer model. Absolutely amazing guitars that I fully funded by way of the Sweetwater Gear Exchange. I recommend that you create an account. You can do so for free, start buying, and start selling. Now back to the interview.
And then some of that was Walter.
Yeah. You got here a little bit face.
Top Scott did a great job.
Oh. It's kind of like a palm muted arpeggio.
Yeah, they get in the same signature stuff I used to do for Quincy.
Yeah.
Definitely the biphaser.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the MVP pedal, right?
Yeah, I think that was the big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are guys that have used them even for Leslie's. They can be pretty good at.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So, man, yeah, I was always wondering. I was like, man, like, you've got all these heavy hitters in the same room. Like, how do you determine? And you're totally right. Like, they would just kind of do like a revolving door of musicians, and then
and most of the tracks, I remember working on one track with them. It was another song that I don't even think the song made the cut, because you think about all these players with Steely Dan that, they would try 10 guitar players, and that solo that Jay did, I think he said he was like the 10th guitar player.
Yeah, I think even Robin Ford was brought in for that.
Yeah. But, and it's not that the other guys didn't play great stuff, it's like those guys just, they heard it a certain way, and you couldn't even ask them what they were looking for.
Yeah.
It was just all subliminal. And the other guys who were like that was, believe it or not, were the Beegees.
Really?
And I went down to Florida and worked with them, and for sure it was the same deal, And,
what songs of the Beegees did you play on?
well, I did play on Saturday Night Fever on the soundtrack.
Okay.
And that's how I met those guys.
So were you doing the wah wah part, and like you were doing that one?
Exactly.
All right.
and so then I went down to work on oh my goodness, what's the main guy from the Beegees?
Barry.
So he also did a solo album.
Yeah.
And so there was just an incredible group of guys that went down to Miami to record on that record.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty much all over that record, but it was kind of the same thing. You would take a week to work on one song.
Yeah.
And so the tracking was even more interesting. And there was an incredible pianist, vibraphonist, and drummer named Victor Feldman.
Okay. Yeah.
And he was very famous in the jazz world too. And Victor in those days, going back to Steely Dan now, Victor was the guy they would call to actually be on the tracks and do all the chordal foundations and help those guys, because it was pretty amazing songs they were writing, and pretty harmonically pretty sophisticated.
Yeah.
Very sophisticated. And Victor was the one guy that was a real studio guy, but he was also a real jazz guy at heart. And he could hang with those guys and with Steely Dan and even with Walter, he would help him with guitar parts and stuff like that. So Victor was a big part of that. And then Victor came down to work on Barry's record with the Beegees,
Mm-hmm.
So he was kind of one of those unsung talents that did all that.
Yeah, well, they certainly figured out like a way to sort of bridge, like the sophistication of a jazz tune and give it a pop sensibility where it would get radio play, and that ability is incredible. Like, people didn't know they were hearing, the chords that they were hearing and the modulations and all sorts of stuff. It was
and the records still hold up today.
They absolutely do, 100% do. I'm wondering if I could play a little bit of that. I didn't realize that you'd played the wah-wah parts. Do you know what wah-wah you were using back then?
Yeah, I was a crybaby.
It's a Crybaby
Yeah.
in probably your deluxe reverb, you think, too?
I would think so, yeah.
And your 335.
Oh, definitely the 335. You know, the 335 was famous. I mean, maybe in today's world, it would have. I think I had my guy work on it since those early days. But in those early days, the Gibson 335s were famous for not staying in tune.
Mm-hmm.
So when I developed the LR10 with Ibanez, and a friend of mine just bought a pristine one the other day and had me sign it, and it was like pretty ridiculous. And Ibanez was just coming up in the guitar world in Japan, and so they, I sort of replaced the 335 with the Ibanez, and it was mostly not because of the sound or any of that. The 335 was amazing, and it had the history of playing on all those hits, but it was a mother to tune.
Right. So this is the stability of the Ibanez just made it a lot easier. I'm sure touring wise, it was made it a lot easier.
Yeah, no, the Japanese, they just nailed it.
Yeah.
So that's that part. But, the 335, and Jay Graydon he'd be complaining all the time in those days when he was playing one, and he said, they were cursing, can't get these in tune,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a G string on a Gibson can be a tough string to tune. Well, I want to just play a little section of just that wah intro because it's just so iconic. We will get right back to the interview with Lee, but before we do, I want to tell you about Lee's brand new album that he did in collaboration with Dave Grusin called Brazil. Now, Dave and Lee flew down to Brazil to record this record and recorded it with some of Brazil's premier session musicians and jazz musicians. And they've created a brilliant record, which is one of my favorites of Lee's in years. I highly recommend that you check out Brazil. All of the links will be in the description as well as below here so that you can check out this brand new record by Lee Ritenour. Highly recommend if you're a guitar player, you're into great guitar tones, you're going to love this. Go check it out. Now back to the interview with Lee. And you doing rhythm too?
It has to come back to me now. Let me think about it. Let me hear it a little bit. Yeah.
That sounds like a Ritenour sensibility.
And they were so funny because they had the orchestration of their voices, against the track. It was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, their ability to harmonize was incredible, and they were a lot of those harmonies are real close, there's no margin.
No, they were like, kind of out of the church almost, and
They were Australian, right?
Yeah. Very talented crew.
And wrote a lot for other people, as I recall. Yeah.
And they were another bunch that they did not mind spending forever on one song, making it right.
And would they chart all that stuff for you, or would they just kind of give you like a chord outline?
I think Michael Mardian was doing some of that stuff.
Okay.
And Michael usually would write a chart, something pretty simple, but but most of the stuff was, and there would be sometimes kind of a very raw demo.
Yeah.
I don't even remember how people were doing their demos in those days, but it was pretty basic.
Right. You definitely had to choose, like when you're doing those opening chords, let's say with the wah that you're kind of, doing in combination with just the rhythm that's under it. I mean, you're probably choosing like, okay, I need to do this higher voicing here because it's going to cut over like what you're doing, the lower register of the rhythm.
Yeah, and
that's not on the chart.
No. Yeah, that's what
they paid you for.
That's why they hired us. Yeah. Yeah, if we just played on the chart, we'd be maybe doing a TV show or a movie date back in those days, and that's it, So.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. That's such a great part and so iconic, and of course the movie made it all the more bigger.
Yeah. No, the movie was huge. Yeah.
So, do you remember like the first really big hit that you played on where you heard yourself on the radio?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. It might have been on that first album of the Brothers Johnson, because also I had Lewis come over to my house in Sherman Oaks. I was living, and I was just doing my first album, First Chorus, for Epic Records, and that was 1976, and I had already recorded with Lewis on
the first Brothers Johnson.
Yeah, the first Brothers Johnson album. So that it was around that period. There was also I take it back. There was also I caught the tail end of where Dave Grusin was producing and arranging for Sergio Mendes and Brazil '66, and they were having all those hits.
Okay,
and I'm not going to remember the name of which tune, but I'm on one of those latter ones that was still a pretty big hit for Sergio.
All right,
yeah.
Awesome,
yeah,
awesome. Well, the next song that I want to talk to you about, which there's an interesting story I've heard from Jeff Lorber and I've heard from Paul Jackson Jr., that a lot of the guitar on the song "Give Me the Night" by George Benson is actually not George Benson. So I'm wondering if you would clarify the rumor mill that's been going on since I guess that record came out in 1980.
Yeah,
but probably was recorded before then. What parts did you play on the song "Give Me the Night"?
Well, I mean, George has this incredible signature sound and style, of course, and one of the most phenomenal guitar players ever, and I loved him. I was always a huge fan of his from the very early days of all the bebop stuff he was, and he just had phenomenal chops and everything. So he was, Tommy LaPuma had already made him a huge hit record with Breezin', and Masquerade and all that, and so he was already off and running and doing his thing. And then by the time Quincy got to him, George was all about the hits, and he just wanted to have hits. So he was a little superstitious, and so he always wanted me, if possible, to be on playing behind him on the record days, because he said, whenever RITENOUR'S on the date, he says, I get a hit record, which of course was totally not true. But, but that's what George thought. So when Quincy came along, Quincy definitely, I think what Quincy liked about me and the certain players that he hired, whether it was drums or bass or whatever it was, as definitely in my case, he liked the way that we played the time, and could create a track rhythm-wise, and contribute to a track. So on the George Benson thing, Quincy called me before the record started, and he said, Lee, George has already had done all this stuff, but we got to create a new path for him. We got to take him to the next level. He says, you got to help me update his guitar sound. And I said, update George Benson's guitar sound? that sounds like anti-religious. But I knew what Quincy was talking about, in the sense that he just wanted to see if there was anything that we could do to give it a little bit of a fresh twist for that. I guess it was the 80s thing.
Yep.
So, and Quincy always was using Kendon recorders down there in Burbank. It was a fantastic studio. It's no longer there, like most of the studios. And I had a house up in Burbank, very close to there. So I would go down to Kendon and work with George, and we plugged him into all this stuff. But it didn't really work, because that's not where George was coming.
Right.
He had his hands, when he picked up anybody's guitar, it sounded like George Benson, of course.
Yeah.
And he had that great jazz guitar sound. So I think and I'm not going to remember, I know you're going to ask me what amps and stuff like that. And I probably brought over my Paul Rivera pedal board setup then, and it was a big setup, and George knew nothing about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think I ended up having him plug into my rig, or I plugged him into my rig, and we used some compression that normally he wouldn't have, and some subtle chorusing, and a few things. Nothing out of the nothing too radical.
Yeah.
Because it still had to sound like George.
Yeah.
And so we, and a little fresher reverb and stuff like that. So just stuff that his stuff was current, and that was good enough for Quincy because he just wanted him to fit in whatever the sound was that him and Bruce Sweetwater were working on at that time.
Okay. And then the other rumor is that part of the solo is you, and part of the solo is George, not because George couldn't play it, because there was some sort of accident in the studio.
Well, that was the funny part of the story. So on "Give Me the Night," there's a nice guitar solo, but it's a pretty thought out. Quincy took a million takes out of George and put something together, and it's more of a pop type solo in the sense that it's not just George blowing all over the thing. Right. It's pretty organized.
Well, he had to be able to scat over it, right? Because that's kind of the signature sound.
Exactly. So they were finishing, the record was all done, and Bruce Sweetwater and Quincy were mixing the record at the same studio at Kendon Recorders. Now, Kendon had another room down the street, down the same block, so it was a big operation there. And so there's my Quincy. And so apparently they were mixing, and the second engineer accidentally put George's track into record. I don't know how that happened, but and in those days it was all 24 track tape.
Yeah.
And so and they had these, they called them slave tapes, right? But Quincy he'd have a whole tape of vocals.
Yeah.
He'd have a whole tape of horns. And he'd leave it to Sweetie to be syncing all this stuff, and they'd have 3 or 4 24-track Studer machines going. I mean, they were, so now we've got a million tracks on Pro Tools or Logic or whatever you want to use, right? But Quincy was using, I think he said on "Give Me the Night," it was over 100 tracks of stuff. And one 24-track tape was only 24 tracks. So it was always complicated, and they were bouncing down the vocal stack. So that was Quincy's sound. He would stack all this stuff and then mix it, and Bruce Sweetwater would take it and find. So I can see how something got messed up like this, and God bless the second engineer. I hope he's still working. But after that night, I'm not sure. And so it was like midnight or something, and I had finished up whatever I'd been doing during the day on sessions, and I wasn't with Quincy, it was with other people, and I remember I had just turned out the lights, and the phone rang, and I said, calling at this hour, right? And Quincy said, "RITENOUR." "Yeah, this is Q. You got to get down here right now." I said, down where? He said, "To Kendon." He said, "We got to fix George's solo." George's what happened? And then he told me that the second engineer accidentally, put it in record on the last few bars of the solo. And George was already at his place in Hawaii. He'd already left, and they said they had to mix the song that night or day or whatever, and there's no way they could ask George to come back. I said, "So what do you want me to do?" They said, "Well, you got to punch in George's stuff. All his gear is here. You set it up in the first place." I said, "Oh man." So I went down there, and they had cassette. It was like, remember those? Yeah. And so they had a cassette of the solo.
Yeah.
That they had, run off for George or something, right? And so they played it a few times for me, and then I was pretty familiar with what we were doing with George's rig, because I had basically set it up, for George to have that sound, and it wasn't difficult. It wasn't like the rigs we have today, and it was a little bit of chorusing and some obviously reverb that they were doing through the board, and maybe a little delay that I had. I forget what I was using on delay on him. So it was just adding a few subtle effects, nothing big in today's world.
Yep.
And so, sure enough, the last, 3 or 4 bar, I think it was really just the last 2 or 3 bars of the solo that, but I ended up replacing some place that made sense to, if you play it, I can tell you.
All right.
And then, so when we fixed it and we finally got it right, and it sounded pretty good, and Quincy and Bruce Sweetin and I went, wow, it's like, and then Quincy said, never ever tell George what happened, and I said, okay, I won't say a thing, and so now it was like 3 a.m. or something, it was like we took hours to do these 4 bars, and I had to learn the part and obviously double the scatting. So the guy didn't delete the scatting part.
Okay.
That was on another track.
So you had to play to the time of this scat.
Yeah, exactly. So in a way that made it easier.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the end of the story finally is years later. I'm talking like a decade later.
Yeah.
I was pretty close with George, and we were on a lot of tours together, and I was we either did jazz festivals co-billing, or I was opening, he was closing, whatever. And so we're walking in the airport one day together, and I said, George, did I ever tell you the story, which I knew I hadn't, I ever tell you the story of Give Me the Night and what happened to your guitar solo? He said, no, brother. He called everybody brother, right? No, brother, tell me. And so I told him what happened, that he was in Hawaii, and Quincy swore me to sequestry, and Quincy, and then George just busted out laughing. He said, oh man, now I got to pull up that track and see if I can tell if it's you. He said, I never knew it wasn't me, and he said, you did a good job, and it made a lot of money, so I'm happy.
Well, I guess a previous point, right? That when you play on stuff, it gets the hits. So
That's right.
Well, let's pull it up. Let's listen to it. I've got a nice little ISO section of it where we can really hear the guitars only. So, and you played the rhythm guitar a little on parts of this too.
Yeah.
So let's.
So I worked a lot on the record, even as a rhythm player.
Sorry for the interruption. We will get right back to the interview with Lee, but I wanted to tell you about what I actually do for a living. Although I get to interview some of these amazing guitar players, my actual job is manufacturing guitar pedals. And I have one guitar pedal that I'm really excited to tell you about, which is called our Ultraphonix. And it's based on a Dumble Overdrive Special, which is one of the most rare and unique overdrive amplifiers ever manufactured. I'll show you a little clip here compared to 2 different original Dumble Overdrive Special amplifiers so you can hear it for yourself. So you heard it there. It's warm, it's rich, it has all the things that you would want out of a great Dumble style pedal. So do check it out. Over from our approved vendors, we have a list of dealers in the description below. Now back to the interview with Lee. Well, let's listen. You can hear Quincy actually call it off, so listen to this.
Give me the 90s, take 4.
That's funny. The doo-doo is definitely George. But that part's me.
This here.
Yeah.
So you doubled that probably, it sounds like. That
Well, I think I was using an octave divider.
okay.
Yeah.
Neutron
Most likely, yeah.
in 335 8.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
In your Paul Revere rig.
Yeah.
And you think like your deluxe or...
By that time, I might have moved on because Paul Revere was, everybody was starting to develop custom amps.
Yeah.
And so I think, I don't remember exactly which step I went.
I remember Paul was modding, Fenders to trick him out. And then he was in the picture at that time.
Yeah, I think actually I might have moved to a twin
Okay.
by that time. And by that time, I was using stereo.
Yeah.
So, and I think Paul had modded it. So
Yeah.
that it was a lot punchier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you use the classic Boss Roland stereo chorus where you could get
Yeah,
your stereo?
exactly. Yeah. And then when that first came out and we all went to stereo, it was like, wow, it was like heaven.
Yeah, I bet it was. I bet it was. And there's also a preamp in those that has a sound. Like now there's companies actually just make the preamp section of that chorus, so you can just kind of get like the kind of the gain and the mid punch that it provides.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Which is what it used to do in these days. Yeah.
Let me skip to the solo here and let's see if we can detect which part's you. So are you the descending?
Yeah, all that at the end. Yeah,
So cool.
Yeah. All that. And I think the 2 bars before that as well.
Yeah.
It's almost easier to tell on the regular track than the way you've got it.
The isolated.
Yeah.
Man, that's so cool. That's so cool. Like,
But George especially loved the story years later when I told him.
yeah, I bet. Well, again, I think it just proves his point that you're the good luck charm for the success of his records. I want to take a real detour now into something that's totally dissimilar, which I had no idea that you were involved with, which was your work with Pink Floyd.
Oh yeah,
and you were on the wall on multiple songs,
right.
And I would love to hear from you just like about what a Pink Floyd session is like, how you got that call. I know you're Uncomfortably Numb.
Right.
You're also on the wall. And it just said Lee Ritenour was brought in to thicken things. So I want to know what that means as well.
Well, they, that was early enough in the pop record business that a group like Pink Floyd was not supposed to be using session guys.
Yeah.
That was like a no-no.
You had your guitar god and,
and they were a band, it was like, what are they doing? Yeah. But it turned out that Bob Ezrin was the producer on that part. And he originally, and I had worked with him with some other artists. Mm-hmm. And I think, I might be wrong about this, but Ezrin even produced one of the sessions that Barry Gibb did in Miami for his solo record. And so everybody was all connected. And, so then when I got the call for Pink Floyd, already they were huge, and they were a band. And I knew why I got the call because it was Bob Ezrin producing, but I thought, wow, that's strange. I thought they did everything themselves, and then, and of course they had great guitar playing on the record, already. So, but anyway, so I had this huge, like we all did in those days, we had a case that's the size of this room, that full of like 21 guitars and mandolins and banjos and bazookas and strats and jazz guitars and Martins and D18s and all the 12 strings, which some of the guys wouldn't play the 12 string. There's a great story about Barbra Streisand and me playing the 12 string too, I can tell you. But anyway, so the idea is for us that we were going to play together, and do the and is it the high string? And
high string. It's a high string on a Comfortably Numb,
right? Yeah, and then he's playing the regular acoustic, I think.
Yeah, I think I've seen him say that it was some sort of like Martin Dreadnought or something.
Yeah,
like a D28 or something like that.
So anyway, going back to my rig, so I said I'm going to impress these guys with my rig, and my box full of guitars, So I come in and it was at Producer's Workshop in Hollywood, and it was a medium-sized room, not a small room, but not gigantic either, but a good-sized room, and it was just full of his guitars.
It's wall to wall.
Oh, yeah, literally wall to wall, and every killer guitar that known to mankind that you could imagine, and then on top of it, they had all the latest pedal boards and everything, they were into it. So then I get there and they're working on the solo
from Comfortably Numb.
Comfortably Numb, or is it another brick in the wall, right?
Well, there's another brick in the wall which you're credited on, and it just says Lee was brought in to thicken things. It doesn't say what. And then on Comfortably Numb, it says acoustic, like a high string.
Yeah, no, Comfortably Numb for sure. We did together. But then on another brick in the wall, they said we were working on this guitar solo. We've been working on it forever, and we with Roger, and he said we can't figure out how to get out of it, and how to end it. We don't like the ending. He said, would you mind? We'll play you the solo, and you just punch in the last 4 bars and give us some ideas. We won't use it. He's going to play it. But we just, just like to freshen up our mind. And that was actually pretty creative, to have somebody, come in cold and just hear it. And so I got kind of close to his sound and took an hour and a half just to get a sound close enough to his. And then they played me the solo on another brick in the wall. And then the last 4 bars, I like kept punching and trying all these ideas. And then we did that for another hour. And then they finally said, oh, that's great, Lee. That gave us a bunch of ideas. And they said, okay, let's move on to the acoustic stuff. Yeah. And then we did. And then, when the record came out, like, I don't know, 2 years later, I was real curious to hear that solo. Yeah. And it was definitely him. It was not me. It was 100%.
But could you hear some of your influence?
But that's what I was going to say. But the end of the solo, there's a huge influence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the funny thing is that it turns out that they were studying the cats around them too, so they were checking out the records going on for whoever's records it was, and session stuff going on with other guitar players, whether it was Carlton or Dean Parks or Jay Graydon or some of the guys in New York, Huey McCracken and some of those guys. So they for a rock band that was supposed to be just isolated by themselves, they were definitely being influenced by the times as well.
Well, it made for a much better record than probably what it. I mean, it's an amazing record. It's pretty timeless. So, how about we listen to a little bit of "Comfortably Numb" and Another Brick in the Wall, and we'll hear it. Let's hear some your influence here on this solo.
We don't need no education.
It sounds like an EMG pickup.
It really does, right? Yeah. But they had this influence of a little funk going over that. Definitely, they were listening to the LA scene then.
Yeah, it's like the 2 and 4 position strat thing with the EMGs, maybe the preamp,
Kids alone.
Right.
All in all, it's just another brick in the wall.
So did you play any of this? I mean, you're credited on this, but it doesn't say what.
Yeah, I mean, I was just, as that little rhythm pattern went by, that sounded like something I would do. And that's the funny thing about doing this interview with you, is that the Steely Dan thing was the same way. It's like, I know certain things are me, but then earlier on, it was like, that might have been me too,
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I mean, I think that every session musician has like certain signatures, and I would totally get that you could recognize where you like, oh yeah, I do that.
Yeah. So, and we, and all of us were a little bit different. Some of the guys were more chameleons, like Dean Parks. Dean probably might be on more records than any of us, but he's a bit more of a chameleon in the sense that he didn't have as much of his own personality as I was finally emerging with, or Ray Parker was emerging with, or even Robin Ford, or even Jay, so certain guys were more. They just fit into the scene,
right? Yeah, I get that. I mean, some people hire you because they want your specific sound. Yeah, and
that started happening more and more as I got more established.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I totally get it. Let's see if we can get this. Let's see if we get this solo that you were involved in helping.
great sound.
It kind of has a Clapton kind of thing.
Yeah,
The overbend and the...
yeah. That's it. Yeah. So that whole kind of when he went back into the rhythm thing, I started doing that a little bit.
Yeah.
So I was more rhythmical, and so I think they took that influence
Yeah.
because he got up so high.
Yeah.
He had nowhere to go.
Right.
And I remember us talking about that. I said, yeah, you ran out of room, and he still had like another 4 bars to go,
Right.
So then when I tried some stuff, I sort of brought it back down into that little rhythm pattern.
Yeah.
And then he ended up doing something slightly different anyway. But that was the big influence.
That's so cool. That's so cool. I'm going to play now just a little bit of Comfortably Numb so we can kind of hear that high-strung acoustic part. You and David Gilmour, were you guys facing each other? Or?
We were right next to each other. I remember in Producer's Workshop, like I said, it wasn't a big room. And Ezra was such a cool producer. And I said, do we have to be in isolation rooms? Or are we going to I said, no, let's just sit next to each other.
Do you know what kind of acoustic you had for that?
That I had?
Yeah.
I think I had, it wasn't like, $1 million guitar. I think it was a Takamine.
All right. Yeah, the Japanese Martin of the day.
That's right. All right. And then that's what I had as the high string.
So amazing. I always presumed it was a 12 string. I had no idea.
Yeah.
All right. Did you have a sense of this was going to be a huge hit when you were playing on it in the room? Where you're like, oh yeah, this is going to be huge?
No, definitely not. It's like, because everything is, sometimes you just work on 16 bars over and over, they had their tracks and I don't think we were tracking that from the beginning. I think they already had their basic track.
Yeah.
I don't ever remember them playing. I'm sure they had to track it somehow,
Right.
But the bass and drums they definitely piecemealed a lot of stuff together, and that was a talent in those days that people like Pink Floyd, or going back again to the Beegees or Steely Dan, could kind of keep track of their vibe,
Yeah.
and working on one song that long,
Yeah.
and make it work,
That's incredible.
Yeah. So it was, I remember, it might have been one of the guys, was it Teen Parks? There was some session for Richard, oh God, what was the famous producer that,
For the Pointer Sisters?
actually,
Barry?
Yeah.
Yes.
So there was a session where one of the guys, I forget who it was having to play 12 string for hours and hours and hours on this track. They just kept going over and over and over. And I think he almost had some damage.
Wow.
Yeah. It was like, you had to be careful in those days, because some people had some incredible budgets and they didn't mind, so there's a very famous story with the great drummer Jeff Porcaro.
Okay.
And us on a Streisand cut.
Okay.
So, and Barbara lives down the street here, so another one with a unbelievable, phenomenal career, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think we were working on that record, Guilty,
Okay.
and I think it was Barry Gibbs who was producing, right?
Yep.
And so we were at a studio in Hollywood. I think it was Ocean Way at the time,
Mhm.
and we'd already been there for days, and between Barbara and Barry, like each song would take 3 days to do one song,
Right.
And so we were working one night, and it was like 11 o'clock at night. We'd been there since noon or something, and basically had been playing this one tune like for days, for hours and days. And so we're all packing up and we're leaving. We think they got the cut, and Barry comes out and Barbara comes out and says, "She wants to do one more take, guys." And we said, "Oh, no. It's like, usually we're like, if Streisand wants to do another cut, you do another cut, right? But by that time, we'd been there like 12 hours or something, and it was like, no, we're going home. And then Jeff Picaro says, Cats, come on, man. We're into it. Look, we didn't pack up that much. Let's do one more try. And we're all looking at Jeff like, what? And then we all said, oh, okay. So we get our instruments out again. And Jeff said, "You know what, guys? I gotta do one thing. It's gonna drive me crazy, but I gotta go feed my cat. And there's nobody else at home. And I'm just around the corner. It's gonna take 15 minutes. I'll be right back." And so we're I think Michael Martin was on that date, and Michael's looking at Jeff going, "He's gotta feed his cat." Okay. And so we take a break and we're waiting for Jeff. So now an hour goes by, right? And there's no cell phones in those days.
Yeah.
It was like and then all of a sudden, an hour and a half goes by and Barbara's livid, and now people are trying to phone Jeff and nobody's answering, right? And finally, it's like 2 hours go by. It's clear Jeff is not coming back, And so they call the session, and they're just so upset with Picaro, right? And the next date was scheduled for 10 a.m. and we all show up at 10 a.m. the next day, and we thought all hell was going to break loose with Jeff, right? And so Jeff shows up, and they were like practically screaming at him, like, "Where were you? Barbara waited, and we waited. The band waited." And Jeff said, "Oh, I'm sorry, man. My dog had to go. My cat had to go pee, and then it had a problem, and I just couldn't leave my kitty cat."
So
He just shined everybody on.
man. So what do you think really happened? You think there was really a cat in this story?
No, I found out later he didn't have a cat.
All right. So the mystery is maybe we'll have the Hardy Boys take that one up and figure it out.
That was his way of saying goodnight.
Yeah.
But he left the rest of us out to dry.
Right.
Plenty of days, though.
Yeah. And what a great talent.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Jeff was another one. And then, the other day, since you're talking about studio sessions, it was like those Barry White sessions, I Can't Get Enough and Love Theme, and I'm on all those, and but a bunch of other incredible guitar players are on those sessions too. It was Ray Parker Jr. and Dean Parks, and I don't think Carlton was.
No, but David T. Walker.
Yeah, David T. and Wawa Watson.
Yeah.
And so there'd be a line, and we were at the Motown studio there on Beverly, and Wilton Felder was playing bass because Gene Page, the famous arranger, would write these bass parts, and Wilton was a saxophone player, so he was the only really Motown soul player that could read these bass parts, and they were pretty hard sometimes, and sometimes those old Barry White records, they were in 12/8, so they were really slow. And Gene Page would write this stuff for the bass that was kind of syncopated, So if you hear those Barry White records, the bass is pretty syncopated. And then with Ray Parker and David T. and Wawa, and me, though that was the main crew. I was the other reader in the group, right? So I would sometimes be doubling the bass part, you know, and then he would, and other sections of the tune, Barry would go down the line to each of us and sing a part. Okay, you play this RITENOUR, and he'd sing a line, and you'd get it. Don't move off of that. Stay on that. And then he'd say to if Dean was on the date, he'd do the same thing with Dean. He'd sing another part, and then he'd say, David T, now you do your pretty little thing up high, and you come down on the intro, and he would give him direction. But then David T would do his personality stuff.
Got all the minor 9 hammer-on stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then, you know, Wah-Wah would just like, okay, Wah-Wah, don't bring that Wah-Wah in until halfway through, and then give me that, you know, and all this. Yeah. So, and then Ray Parker, he'd come up with some funk line, and the amazing part about it, there was this drummer named Ed Green, and Ed Green, God bless him, I think he's still in Nashville. He moved to Nashville after the Lynn drum machine came out. He said, I'm out of here. And so I think he's still around, and he's on a million records and an incredible drummer. If he did 2 fills in a whole song, that was a lot for Ed Green. Yeah. He just stayed in the pocket, and he would smoke pot from 8 in the morning till midnight, and he would just stay in that pocket. And he was they started using clicks in those days, so we were all playing along with this click, click, click. But Ed just made the stuff feel unbelievable. You know, if you hear those Barry White records, just listen to the drums, and you know you'll hear two tom-tom fills in the whole record. Yeah, you know, Ed just stayed in the corner of the room. And nobody would talk to Ed. He would just like be glued with his headphones and playing that pocket. And those days were fun. Unfortunately, you know, later on, all the strings came in, and in the 80s, it was a big reverb, or something. This was 70s too, but 70s into the 80s, and it had all this big reverb and the strings, and then Barry's voice with a lot of, and it still had the vibe, but the raw tracks were something else. Yeah, I heard somebody came out with, they were able to get those tracks.
The multi-tracks for it.
Yeah.
Get your parts.
Yeah.
I'll have to see if I can dig them up. I'm sure they're amazing.
Yeah, it was big fun those days.
Well, I'm sure with the clicks, though, you probably were used to it from movie stuff, right? Because a lot of the movie stuff still had click tracks.
Oh, yeah. No, they were already early on in the click.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That was the way everybody would keep track of the stuff, you know. Yeah. And but, you know, some of the hipper producers and directors were letting the composers bring in. That's why Dave Grusin was so interesting, because like when we did 3 Days of the Condor, it was the same rhythm section that was working for Quincy.
Nice.
You know, and Dave is all over Quincy's records doing all that all those early synth stuff. And
sure, I mean, he was like really a pioneer in that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so
yeah, and what a talented family, right? Him and his brother, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Lee, there's one more song I want to ask you about for this portion of the interview, and it's your work with the Pointer Sisters. And one of their biggest hits, I'm So Excited. There are 2 guitar credits. It's you and George Deering.
Oh, yeah.
And it sounds like you're maybe using definitely some guitar effects on this, and it sounds like maybe some chorus, maybe some envelope filter or something like that on there.
Oh, yeah.
But I wanted to know if you remember anything about this session, I'm So Excited, and whether you and George were there at the same time, or whether these were overdubs, or how these came about.
Well, it was at, so whose credit was producing? Is it?
That'd be Richard Perry, yeah.
Yeah. So we did it at Richard Perry's studio, and he had a studio on Santa Monica Boulevard then.
Yeah, it was called what studio? There's like a number.
Yeah. God, what was it? It was actually a pretty nice studio.
Like Studio 55.
Studio 55, that's right. And like the bar in New York, right?
Yeah.
And so it was a very fashionable studio, but and Richard Perry was another big character, and he also did some of that work with Streisand.
Yep.
And I was always on his dates a lot, and it was just there's another story about that I'll tell in a minute. But I'm so excited. I think, yeah, we did the tracking date for the Pointers. I worked a lot with the Pointers, you know. And
it was like you and Tim May, I think, have the most credits for Pointer Sisters stuff.
Yeah.
Anybody.
Yeah. And, you know, it was pretty disco-oriented then. And the interesting thing about when you were talking about the 70s, the guitar was the driving force still.
Yeah.
You know, as you got into the 80s, all electronic keyboards started to come into play, and then the disco music came in, and the guitar was soon to be, you know, forget about it, you know. And so fortunately for me, that was, you know, a little bit before that, like late 70s, I was already heading out towards my solo career. And so, you know, it was like I missed that whole major part of the disco era. But Richard Perry and the Pointer Sisters and some other stuff going on at his studio, they were all catching part of the dance craze. And you know, people like Ian Underwood, the synthesizer player, and a bunch of other guys that were really putting together great, you know, synth sounds at that time. And and it was pretty fresh because it was brand new. All that stuff, you know.
You want to listen to a little bit? See if we can pick out some of your parts. All right, so here we go. Here's Pointer Sisters. I'm so excited. The vocals have been removed so we can kind of focus on the guitar a little better.
That's nice, definitely. I know it from the phrasing. Anything.
And you think you get an octave, like kind of...
Yeah. All that mid-range low.
And it sounds like too. There's like a upstroke.
Kind of. That might have been George. It's hard to tell from the phone.
But you think it's definitely yours, like as far as like the kind of the rhythm comping.
I think I was a little stronger rhythm player at that time. George ended up being a monster guitar player, but at that time I think I had more of those duties. You know, and Richard Perry kind of expected it from me because I had worked on so many records with him.
Do you think that was a 335 or do you think that was a Strat?
You know, the funny thing was, even though I had that Strat, which by the way I lost in the fire, and the serial number was 0335.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but I started towards the tail end of my studio career, I was using that Strat a little bit. But to me, that still sounds like a 335.
And do you think that would have been like your full Paul Revere rig, or do you think that would have been...
Oh, yeah. No, that was definitely the Paul Revere rig.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely sounds like there's some chorus on that, like probably that
E1. That's that sound.
It has a little compression, probably the orange squeezer.
And by that time, I think it was a stereo rig.
Yeah.
So it was got that chorus with that preamp.
Yeah. That's amazing. That's amazing. Well,
that's some shop talk.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that those are the type of people that we attract here, is the people that are into that, and that is everything as far as asking you questions about your studio career. But I do have a few things that I want to show you to end the interview today.
Sure.
Which are some photos from the past, and I think just to in keep with some of the shop talk, I found a photo of your old Paul Revere rig.
That's amazing.
And if you can see on here, you have a couple of Goodrich volume pedals. It looks like one is wired for before everything, and then one is like maybe after the drive section.
And then these TC guys, right?
Yeah, the TC distortion and boost, I think.
Those were great units,
Yeah, Tube Screamer, that Ibanez tremolo phase.
Oh, that was a nice unit too, yeah. And then the envelope filters.
Yep, and then you rehoused, it looked like, or Paul rehoused potentially your orange squeezer into an MXR box there in the bottom left.
Oh, is that what that is?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Why?
And so look, he took a distortion plus and then put your orange squeezer in there, so you didn't have to scratch up your guitar.
You're really a nut going back.
I'm definitely I'm a pedal pervert. And all this stuff.
And thank you for giving me your pedal.
Absolutely. And then it looked like he built like a switch box for you in that top left-hand corner where you could like toggle on and off every loop.
Yeah. Well, that was, I remember, you know, part of this whole problem and why Paul was so phenomenal back in those days was that, you know, we were having all these pedals together. And of course, if you plug 20 pedals in together and run a bunch of cabling, it sounds like,
yeah.
And so he figured out a way to bypass a lot of the stuff and keep stuff in the loop. And Yeah.
Right, especially in sessions, you didn't need to probably do that in real time. You would dial in a sound, and then you would kind of leave it for whatever that section was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was not in real time. But, you know, a lot of these sessions, there's that chorus.
Yeah, and then if you slide way to the bottom, you can see the old school chorus all the way in the bottom right-hand corner. You kind of see it on the floor there, just the tail end.
Oh, wow.
You can see you had it kind of loose on the ground there to do the stereo split, I bet.
That's completely what that was.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then if you slide one more over, it has the rack is on the next frame. So like slide to the next picture in the sequence, and then there's your rack.
Right, with the Eventide.
Yeah, Eventide harmonizer. You got all these Ibanez rack effects. You have a prime time from Lexicon.
The prime time was amazing.
It was like a state of the art for the time, multi effects. Like you know, because it used to be most rack units were just one thing.
That's right.
Right, and so you could have more than one effect, which was pretty advanced for that
And
time.
then what was this Ibanez one?
I think it was either a delay or potentially a modulation device. If you slide over like this direction, it tells you. It has like a little arrow that tells you what it is.
Yeah, the Ibanez 8230.
I think it was a delay.
Yeah, that's probably the delay. And then the Eventide harmonizer, that was a great unit too.
So were you using that for kind of a chorusy like Deacon sort of thing?
Yeah, exactly. Because it would split the sound, but the chorusing would do that. But the Eventide harmonizer, it was just
you could do like -8 cents or 9 cents or something like that on the.
But if you just did a little bit, it just widened the sound.
Yeah.
So
Paul Rivera was your guy back then.
oh, definitely.
And then
all of us were going.
And then you went to Bradshaw kind of after Paul moved to Fender and his own thing.
Yeah. And Bradshaw and Paul, they were like, it was like Carlton and I, it was like an evolution of each of the years as we all went on.
Yeah.
So Bradshaw was the next version of, took it to another level.
Were those a lot to maintain, like when you were on the road all the time? Like,
well, see, that was the problem, is that all this stuff that Paul and Bradshaw were primarily doing were designed for the studio.
Yeah.
Not necessarily just studio musicians, but really studio. And then, guys like Lukather and stuff, and, broke out huge with Toto and then started to take this stuff on the road.
Yeah.
But when I started going on the road, I was doing more of the jazz festivals and in Europe, and then I got huge in Japan, but taking these big flight cases.
Right.
I remember we did used to show up to LAX or Kennedy or wherever we were in the States, and there were the guys dealing with your luggage outside at the curb.
Yeah.
And you'd show up with 10 huge anvil cases, and you'd pop the guy $100 and you were good.
Yeah.
And they knew everybody's name. Hey, Lee, how you doing, man? You've been working on a new record, And I said, yeah, we're going on tour, and here's like 20 cases, and some of them are that big. And you just pop the guy a bunch of money, and that's not the way life is now.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, it seemed like the infrastructure was just different back then for this sort of thing. But I mean, you have to think like those Eventides and stuff like those were made to just be like sitting, in your mix bus. They weren't made to be like traveling around and jostling.
Exactly. And that's when we also started to come up with pedalboard systems that were smaller and smaller, that worked more, succinctly on the road.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here's a photo I found of you where you got a bunch of Mutron effects. You got something that looks like Frank Zappa had some sort of custom tape machine on like a tape delay on the floor, and that's you with your trusty ES335. Do you have any idea what session this might have been?
Wow.
If it's got Frank Zappa's gear on the floor?
That's a really good question. To be honest, no.
Did you ever do any sessions for Frank?
No. I wish I had. He was incredible. So, but where's Frank's stuff?
Well, you can see right here. It says Frank Zappa, and then it looks like he's got like a tape echo cartridge that's built into this like custom.
Oh, you know what? This was at Producer's Workshop also.
Okay.
Yeah, this was definitely at Producers because that was his place.
Yeah,
he loved to work too.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's funny, and the famous mastering engineer that had the mastering in the front part of the studio. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name, but he'd done so many records, and so a lot of people were coming into Producers Workshop in those days. You know, Joni Mitchell was using it, Zappa was using it. You know, all sorts of people were coming in and out of that place. So now that you put it in perspective, I'm not surprised that
and you can see you got
he's got that tape to like.
Yeah, then you got a Crybaby, and you got like, it looks like you have maybe like one of those jet flangers or phasers over there, and you got some neutron stuff on the floor.
Yeah, it looks like my stuff was totally disorganized.
Well,
but then I was using this guy, right?
Yep.
Which is, oh my goodness, wow, some incredible stuff.
Yeah.
So, but I hadn't evolved to the syntax yet. That was still to come.
Yeah. And then let's see, I got a couple more here to show you. Okay, so here is the last one that I wanted to show you. Also, a little past that time was you had this beautiful Valley Arts.
Oh yeah.
Presumably, you know, when you were seeing Paul, it would have been in Valley Arts. For Paul Revere was out of there doing all the repairs and stuff like that.
Absolutely, you know. And then Mike was, you know, the owner of Valley Arts.
And Al Carnes.
Yeah, Mike McGuire and Al Carnes, who, you know. So there's a great story about them.
All right, let's hear it.
So, my main teacher, when I was a kid growing up, was a guy named Duke Miller.
Mm-hmm.
And later I went to USC, right? And later I got Duke the gig, heading up the guitar department at SC, you know, to come in and create a jazz and a pop guitar, electric guitar program, because they already had classical with Christopher Parkney, and who I studied with there. But going back when I was a kid, Duke Miller had a music store on Laurel Canyon Boulevard, and I think it was just called Duke Miller's. And so once a month, he'd get all his students and he'd write out all these charts, and there'd be like 20 or 25 guitar players, and he'd write out, you know, I don't even remember what songs they were, but it would have guitar 1, guitar 2, guitar 3, and then there'd be a little guitar bass part, and it'd be all guitar players playing these charts. And the hardest parts would be guitar 1 down to the simplest parts. And he'd have all his students, you know. And so I was like 14 or 15 studying with Duke, and I was always a good reader.
Yeah.
So who else was in those classes was Al Carnes and Mike McGuire. So I was 14 and they were maybe 16 or 17.
Okay.
And then Mike tells the story now that everybody hated me because I was like, you know what, maybe I was, you know, come to think about it, I was even younger because I started studying with Duke when I was 12.
Yeah.
And so, you know, so it was 12, 13, 14, it was those years.
Yeah.
And from the beginning, I wanted to be a good sight reader.
Yeah.
And I ended up being one. And and Al tells the story that everybody was always jealous and pissed off at the kid because I could read everything the first time and nobody else could, you know. But it was a great period. And so then Al and Mike ended up taking over Duke's store.
Right.
When Duke got the gig teaching at SC. And then they took over that same store and they were managing it for a while, and then they finally bought Duke out and gave him a good price. And then Duke went to do the program at USC. And then later, Mike and Al moved over to Ventura Boulevard there and built that incredible store and operation.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Mike went on to Gibson, head up the custom shop at Gibson, and he built me that Les Paul.
Yeah.
And there's another Les Paul up here. And, you know, that Les Paul is still my go-to accent on the road.
Yeah, I mean, Valley Arts was so synonymous with the best studio players of the era, you know, whether you're talking about Lukather or Larry Carlton or you or Dean Parks, everybody was using the Valley Arts guitars because it was sort of the invention of the superstrat in a way, you know, because it really wasn't people that were putting Floyd Roses or active pickups in sort of a commercial sense.
That's right.
You know?
Yeah.
Were they the ones that modified, like you had that beautiful 50s Stratocaster? Right. Were they the ones that put the Floyd Rose and the EMGs on that one?
Yeah, and later, I didn't regret it from the way it played, because it played great.
Yeah,
and it did exactly what it was supposed to do. But the fact that it messed it up, and it wasn't pristine like the original Strat, But the original Strat, it didn't work for me,
Yeah, I remember like seeing some footage of you like playing it like at a gig in Tokyo before it was modified, and then like a year or two later, you brought it back and it's got the black, pickups on the white pick guard and the Floyd Rose and all that stuff. Did you ever restore it back, or did you always keep it in that condition before you lost it?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I talked to Mike. By that time, Mike had become this incredible craftsman in his own right.
Yeah.
And I said, Mike, is there any chance we can get it restored and do it? And it was so carved out.
Yeah, because you have to route a lot of space for that Floyd.
Yeah.
And then also on the nut to get the locking nut.
Totally. So he said, Lee, we could do a bunch of surgery on it to try to get it back, but it's still going to be the fact that
it's a patchwork for sure.
Yeah, it was patchwork, so it was drilled into. So the answer was no, and I said, okay.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely wouldn't look the same. I can show you a photo of Dan Huff's guitar, because he restored his back.
And I remember Dan was that was sort of that same period that we were considering trying to restore it.
Yeah,
and Dan didn't quite work, did it?
His worked. He ended up, I think, having to use a Wilkinson, which is like a 2-post bridge as opposed to like the old 6-screw that would be on a Fender.
Wow.
So I think there were some compromises. He left I think it's either Schaller or Spurzl tuners on it. But I mean, it's, you can see quite obviously like where the routing holes were. I mean, somebody did a nice job of like painting over it, but it still looks like it's like a different piece of wood that's there.
Yeah.
But
once you carve into these guys, that's the way it rolls,
Yeah. Well, the last thing I'm going to show you before we complete today is a recent interview with Steve Lukather. And he tells a story about you two on a session. And I'd like you to watch it, and I'd love to hear your version of this story, if you don't mind.
Sure.
All right, here we go. So here is Steve Lukather telling a story about you guys. Here we go.
I remember being young, and I had gotten a flat tire to a date. Now, this Gene Page date was full orchestra, full strings, horns, live vocals, full, there was 3 guitar players, and I was like guitar 2.
Who would be the other 2 guys, for example?
RITENOUR'S guitar 1, obviously.
Okay.
And somebody else, it may have just been the 2 of us, I don't remember. But I showed up late because I got a flat tire on the way to the gig.
Okay.
So I barely snuck in. And Rit was there, and we had just worked on something before. He took a little bit of a shine at me. I love the kid. And I get there, and of course I'm sitting at guitar 2. And I'm panicking, Rit. And Gene Page is like, I'm really sorry, my car broke. I had to announce it to 70 people in the room. So I'm this little zit-faced punk ass. Who is this guy? And I put my shit, and I get plugged in, and they're ready to take it. It's going direct to 2 track.
Oh no.
Direct to 2 track. There's no can I punch my part in? No, man. And just as he started to count it off, I look at my part, and it's the piano part in D flat, no chord symbols.
Oh my God.
I got no time to skull it, nothing. And I look over at Rit, and he's got like tacit, which means layout, and fill, a couple chords on his. Mine looks like somebody wiped their ass with paper. And I must have looked at him like I saw my grandmother bent over in the shower, so my whole color like a cartoon. And by the count of 2, Rit did this. He bailed me.
Wow.
And it was a hard part. He sight read it perfectly, of course. And I had time to go, I got 16 bars to kind of collect myself, and then I just have to go, or something like that. You know what I mean? And he's sight reading the block chords.
Problem.
Oh,
no problem.
He said stuff for breakfast. He's one of the best readers, as well as a brilliant musician. But he saved me. He could have let me die.
Okay, so
and he could have ruined my career, because everybody in that room would have gone, I saw that guy. He can't read. He can't. He saved my ass.
You remember that?
Oh, very well. Yeah.
So what do you remember about...
Well, he tells it pretty spot on, but that was the thing about Gene Page, going back to those Barry White dates, you know, is like if you did get the reading chart, either doubling the bass or doubling the piano or kind of a piano part, because they wouldn't just write guitar parts, so it would be kind of an extracted piano part, which made it always harder.
Yeah.
You know, and so then I just, and one thing that Luke didn't say is that I got to the date on time and got all my stuff straight and everything, and then I had done so many dates with Gene Page and stuff, and I was established that, you know, and the contractor said, yeah, your guitar one, Lee, and this young kid's coming in to see Lukather, he'll be guitar too. I said, well, that's cool. And so I pull out the chart, and it's exactly like Steve said, you know, some fills over some chords, and on the chorus, you know, there was like one little line to play, but it was mostly just improvised, you know, and it was the color chart, you know, it was like bring the personality. And then I happened to look at, because we were sitting kind of close to each other, and I happened to see book 2, and again, it was just black with notes, you know, and I knew Steve. I had been introduced to Lukather by David Page, who was obviously the piano player in Toto, and David and I were closer to the same age and had done a whole bunch of sessions, and I had met Steve when he was a teenager, and David Page was always raving about Luke. You know, he said, man, Luke is coming on, man. He's 17 now, but watch out, he's going to be one of the cast, man. He's like phenomenal. And the little bit I had heard in those days, I said, yeah, I could tell, because I think he was one of the Valley Arts guys hanging at Valley Arts. And so Mike McGuire used to talk fondly about him, and then he, you know, being him being a teenager, he'd pick up an axe at Valley Arts when we were over there, and he'd be, you know, just smoking, and it was like, I was like, okay, yeah, this guy's got it. Yeah. So I knew he was going to be a phenomenal talent. So it made sense. I didn't, you know, he puts me up like on a pedestal, like I bailed him out, but you know, it just made sense to help out too, you know? Yeah. Because I somehow I already had it in my head that he wasn't really a reader. I mean, Steve read more than some of the guys, you know, but not what was required there. Yeah.
Well, Lee, I'm just so appreciative of your time today and your willingness to take us through all these great songs and in this part of your career, which is not often highlighted because your jazz career, your solo artist career is so overshadowed. You overshadowed this stuff, but I can't thank you enough for everything that you've done and your influence. And if people want to check out what you're up to, what's coming up for you, is there anything that you would want to tell us about?
Well, yeah, as we're in 2024, you know, I did do a new record, and we actually recorded it last year, and finally it got all finished here in my new studio. We were able to wait until this was done and mix it here, but Dave Grusin, the legendary composer and record company guy and incredible pianist, and just, you know, was a phenomenal musician. We had a chance to go down to Brazil last year and record a whole record down there with Brazilian singers and Brazilian players, and some other Brazilian musicians recommended these players. My son, my wife is Brazilian, so Wesley, my son, is half Brazilian, and he follows all the guys down there. And normally we would ask Wes to play on it, but he says, no, Dad, go get this drummer Edu Ribeiro down there, and get this bass player, and then Chico Pinheiro, this incredible jazz guitarist and Brazilian singer who lives in New York most of the time now. I called him, and we had already done a gig at the Hollywood Bowl together, and he recommended more players, and then he had a great song that I wanted to record, and he says, I'm going to be down there. So we got him. And then there was another, and all these singer-songwriters, for the most part, are guitar players. You know, so Celso Fonseca, another guy, had another great tune. And basically, I had found these tunes, you know, and it turned out, you know, a lot of them are great acoustic guitar players, you know, in that Brazilian sense. But in today's 24 kind of sense, you know, and And then we hooked up with Ivan Lins, the great legendary Brazilian singer that worked with Dave Grusin and I in the 80s. And, so it's really a nice record, and a lot of nice guitar playing on it. I mean, I do some too, but I'm talking about the other guys on the record. And it's a real collaboration with Dave and I, and it's great to celebrate all these years of working with him. And and you know, it's funny. Age is a funny thing. You know, if you're lucky enough to do music either as a hobby or as a living, you know, keep doing it, because every time, like, you know, Dave is almost 90 years old, but he's one of those guys that when you're talking to him, he's like 45 or 50. It's like his mind is like sharp, his piano playing is sharp. And the more we go on the road, even though we hate the airports and all that, you know, and things get messed up, but you know, the music can keep you young.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And when could we look forward to that?
So the streaming part of the record will be out in the second quarter. So probably like in you'll start to hear something about the album is entitled Brazil, but with an S, Brasil.
Okay.
And it's also incredible harmonica player Gregor Moret on that from Switzerland. And it's you know, a lot of Brazilian Portuguese vocals on it, and so it really nice record. So the streaming will come out probably in April.
Okay.
And the hard release with the vinyl and the CD, which they still have.
Yeah.
That'll be in June.
We'll make sure that once that's out, that's also tagged in the description of the video, so people can be directed to that once it's available.
Oh, that's great.
Great.
Okay.
Well, Lee, again, just thank you so much for everything, and yeah,
Think about some of these answers. You know, it's like,
we would be remiss in not talking to you about this part of your career, you know, because everybody wants to talk to you about you know, about RIT, or you know, like Is It You, or you know, and a little bump in like songs I love. But I really wanted to hear about this part, and so I'm just so grateful that you make time for us today. Thank you.
Very cool.
All right.
Ciao, ciao.